Awesome. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Just a few quick logistics. If you could mute yourself while our guest is speaking, which I see everyone already has, that would be awesome. If you have a question, please use the chat feature to write it out or indicate that you'd like to ask it directly by raising your hand. And we will be recording this session as we have already begun. And if you would prefer not to be recorded, feel free to turn off your video at any point or to keep it off. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Saud, and I'm a research assistant at Brighter Spark, and I am presenting this introduction on behalf of Allison Van, the executive director here at Spark, a Center for Social Research Innovation. And welcome to today's Spark Talk, titled Empowering Indigenous Research Action Partnerships with Sara Buckingham. I would like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. So Sara Buckingham is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Her research, practice, and teaching integrate clinical, community, and cultural psychology. With Alaska Native elders, she co-developed Knowing Who You Are, Becoming the Cultural Identity Project to support Alaska Native people's well-being. We're very excited to have you today, Sara, so please take it away.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for being here. As I was sharing with folks before you popped into the room, it's very early here in Alaska. If I'm guzzling coffee, that's why you'll have to excuse me. So I'm excited to talk with you today about a project that we have had going on in Alaska for a long time. But before I kind of dive in, I wanted to situate you to where I am privileged to live. So I live on the lands of the Dena'ina in what's called South Central Alaska, oftentimes when we organize it. It is the most populated area in Alaska. About half of the people that live in what is now the state of Alaska currently live in the Anchorage area here in the South Central region. Anchorage is home to many Indigenous peoples from across the state. A lot of people relocate to Anchorage for services, relocate here for university, relocate here for jobs, and as well for healthcare later in life. And so it's oftentimes called kind of Alaska's biggest little village because we have people from all around the state who end up living for a time in Anchorage. Some people return home, others stay here for the long run and make Anchorage their home. I have lived here for 7 years now. I am not Indigenous to Alaska. My ancestry is actually from Germany, and I grew up in southwestern Colorado. It's a little bit funny that I'm the person presenting here today, but like I said, it is very early here, so we don't have other folks that are around. But I am here representing a much, much bigger team that we're all involved in this project. And so I want to give great thanks to the members of our community advisory board, our project team, the elders who you'll get to know as we talk about this work, as well as our many partners and the students that have participated in this project over the years. Today, we're going to talk about three main things. We're going to talk about the context in which this project developed. We'll talk about the project itself, and then open it for discussion around whether or not counterspaces can be an entry point for more structural, empowering change beyond the spaces themselves. I do want to mention that this research that I'm going to be presenting here to you today was supported from the National Institutes of Health. It did not reflect anybody's opinion other than my own. And it was approved by the Alaska Area Institutional Review Board, as well as our community advisory board for this project. I know you all are situated in a university, and so you probably have had these experiences. But oftentimes when we talk about universities, we talk about them as being places of great promise, right? As empowering settings. In theory, they are places that we go to in order to facilitate our own growth and development. They're places where people are able to raise awareness of injustice and really understand the world in new ways. And because of that, universities in theory are places that we can catalyze change. And we talk about them a lot when we talk about the role of the university. But at least where I live and in many places around the globe, oftentimes universities are really neo-colonial settings that privilege certain people and practices over others, and oftentimes marginalize cultures, as we have very particular ways in which the universities are set up to enculturate people to a very particular way of being. And so, what that requires for a lot of people is assimilation and accommodation, right? Learning how to operate within a system and changing your practices to meet that system, even if it's not true to yourself and who you are and how you want to live and be in the world in order to be successful in a setting. Now, here in Alaska, we actually find that a lot of Alaska Native people, while many come to university, many also choose to leave in part because of kind of this paradox of our university setting. And that's the story in which this project is built. I want to introduce you to the concept of counterspaces if you're not already familiar with them. Counterspaces are spaces that are developed by and for people experiencing oppression. And when we set out on this project, we didn't originally envision it as a counterspace, but it became clear to us as we were looking at the projects through new eyes and new ways of knowing that what was built in this space was a counterspace. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here today. Counterspaces actually come out of the educational sphere, out of higher education. And there are spaces oftentimes for Black and Brown people in primarily white facing institutions to have places for solidarity building and to be able to navigate the system. So counter spaces are thought to promote solidarity building among their members, to provide social support, to provide healing from racism and oppression in the larger institution, to allow people to attain resources and to support that resource attainment by helping people navigate spaces, to promote skill building, as well as to foster resistance to oppressive structures. They also provide an opportunity for counter storytelling, right? Or creating new narratives about ourselves and how we operate in a space. And ideally, counter spaces then are thought to lead to empowerment or changes outside of the counter space themselves. But there's been very limited research that actually looked at the ripple effects of counter spaces beyond the setting. Before we return to that concept, though, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of the Cultural Identity Project. And the Cultural Identity Project is a project that predates me, but my area is really in how our contexts around us shape how we engage in culture and what that means ultimately for our well-being, particularly among groups that have found their cultures oppressed within settings. So when I came to the institution back in 2017, I met with lots of people talking about my work and figuring out how we might be able to collaborate together. And I started to talk a lot with our Native Student Services on campus, which is our setting for our Indigenous students, for Alaska Native and American Indian students. And we started to talk about the challenges that they were seeing for students here on campus and talking about a lot of the university paradoxes that we saw and wanting to figure out how could we create programming and support for students that would help them throughout their university journeys and ultimately transform the university. They worked together to develop an advisory board to oversee any of the work done in this area. So that included Alaska Native faculty, staff, and students at the university, but also included Alaska Native community members that were well respected outside of the institution. And they helped lead us in the work of holding focus groups and talking circles with students on campus to explore cultural identity and identity development and how the university both supported and clashed with students' identity. What came out of that work was not only an understanding of identity development among our Alaska Native students, but also an understanding of the university's role and what might be possible within the setting. And so working with our advisory board, we developed an elder advisory council where we had representation of the major Indigenous regions in Alaska through elders who had very diverse life experiences, from folks who had grown up in very rural areas to folks who had grown up in urban areas, very different genders and life experiences, careers, and very purposely had this very diverse and rich group through which we sought to develop a cultural identity curriculum and create a program plan. Originally, this was conceptualized as a cultural identity project, hence the name, knowing who you are becoming the cultural identity project. And what it ended up looking like, oh, here it is. I put it on the screen. Knowing Who You Are Becoming, the Alaska Native Cultural Identity Project, a collaborative project developed by Alaska Native elders for the next generations of Alaska Native people. What this ended up looking as we co-developed this curriculum together was an 8-week program that was led by elders, informed by the scientific literature as well as local data from our students and traditional wisdom of our elders. We incorporated 5 primary ways of learning about identity development in this curriculum, including storytelling from elders, experiential learning through different hands-on activities, cultural activities, supporting connection through talking circles throughout the project, as well as an opportunity for personal exploration and sharing of identity via an e-portfolio that I'll show you here in a second. What was really critical to our project was having something that could unite a very diverse group of Alaska Native people, young people in this space that come from all sorts of different tribes and regions. If you think back to what I shared at the beginning, Anchorage is an incredibly diverse community, and we don't have simply one group of people who live in Anchorage. And so we really needed a curriculum that was culturally inclusive and sought to help people get to know themselves, but in a place where they were also getting to know others. The content looks like an exploration of identity, thinking about personal identity, our relatives, our land, cultural region history, historical trauma, and healing justice. And then moving into thinking about our cultural gifts and strengths, our life paths, our contributions, and then ending with our story, a ceremony and celebration. We ended up formatting it to fit well within the university structure. And so a typical schedule started with an hour-and-a-half session with elders, where there would be time for small group connecting. Students worked and practiced land acknowledgements, and there was always a phrase of the day that students learned in their languages, followed by an experiential activity, storytelling, a talking circle, and then a closing. And after that, we moved after a break, into a peer support session. And so in that peer support session, the elders were no longer present. Instead, it was a discussion of the session content and thinking about applying content to life. A lot of students seated during this time or did other cultural activities. And then they reflected in these e-portfolios. This is an example of an e-portfolio if you're not familiar with one. Essentially, it's a place, you can think about it, I don't know, use social media, MySpace, maybe back in the day, where students are presented with a set of reflective questions for each day to reflect on the topics that were posed in the group. Then there are elders or other folks from campus reflecting on the questions themselves. So here we have 2 of the elders who were involved in leading this project with just a minute or 2 reflecting on one of those questions. So it's not overwhelming. Alongside resources that they could access, resources for cultural identity and wellness, dig into themselves a little bit more. And then they could craft their e-portfolio in any way they wanted. So this is an example of someone who participated in the project, who changed the background, changed how things were presented, changed kind of what the headers looked like, and added new pages as we went along. And students could make these as private as they wanted to be. So it's something just accessible to themselves, or they could make them as public as they wanted to be. So this particular person wanted this e-portfolio shared out. And so we actually have a link to it on our website to share it out very publicly. Other students chose to keep it to themselves or to their family members or use it to share with next generation. So we piloted this original project. The data that I'll share with you from it was piloted during the COVID pandemic. We were very lucky that we were able to transition this program online, actually, for the project in order to keep everybody safe. And we ended up having 44 Alaska Native students participate in it, all undergraduate students at the institution who ranged widely in age, all the way from 18 to 54. And had spent less than a year at the university up to more than 9 years. A lot of times people come and leave and go. And so we had a number of students who had spent lots of years at the university over time. One group participated in the fall, and another group participated in the spring. And we had a stepped wedge design. So we were able to track how students did on a number of measures compared to their colleagues who hadn't yet participated in the program and see change over time as well as change across groups. I'm not going to be presenting on that data, but I will be presenting on some qualitative data that we got from our students. So as part of our work as well, we held focus groups with students and then with the elders and program personnel. And we had about 2/3 of the students who participated in the project choose to participate in focused groups. And then all of the elders and program personnel participated in the groups. And those groups looked like a semi-structured discussion. Originally, the intention of these groups was to just understand the program's experiences, what students thought about the content of the program, its format, so that we could inform our program overall and modify it over time. We coded that using a transformational grounded theory approach, which really focused heavily on open coding from a team-based process so that all of our analyses were bottom up rather than being applied to the data. Very briefly, we had about students on average came to about 6 of the sessions of the 8 over time and stayed the whole time. And a lot of students talked about finding ways to shift and shape the program so that they could continue it after the formal kind of program at the university had ended that they were participating in. And we also found that the program had a number of positive impacts on students. So it helped students to develop their identity. It helped them have a greater recognition of their cultural strengths. It also helped students to develop more of a sense of community with other Alaska Native students and elders on campus. And it helped promote students' overall emotional and behavioral health and well-being. But what I want to talk to you about is some of the things that came out of our focus groups that seem to go beyond some of the constructs that we were working towards in the program and led us to help think about this program as potentially a counterspace. So one student shared, the person I was when I started this program versus the person I am now has shifted. I feel a stronger sense of belonging, and I genuinely feel like I walked away from this program with much more passion, knowledge, and a deeper understanding of who I am. Another shared, I just think the whole thing is just phenomenal. It's hard to express in words what the 8 weeks was like because it's so much, but it was all positive. It was all empowering. It just gave you the time to think to know that you're okay. Where you come from is okay. Your experiences are okay. That we come from a long line of resilient people and we can keep moving forward. That's like looking deep into it because there's nothing like entering a space and leaving the space feeling more empowered and okay with who you are. That's just really profound. And it was a gift to start off the week. And so as we started to talk as the group that organized this work, we started to think about the program as a counterspace. I was the only non-Indigenous person involved in this program, and I was certainly never the face of the program. I was in the background coordinating, organizing, supporting people in doing the work. I very purposely did not want to be part of the counterspace. Instead, it was led by our elders. It was led by an Alaska Native graduate student and by the students themselves as they work to transform this space as well. And so we started to look through our qualitative data to really understand if we think about this as a counterspace, how did this space operate? What are the things that really worked within the space or the processes that happen to make it function this way? And we came away with really thinking about sense of community, which I'll share with you, as well as thinking about the program as an empowering setting that potentially leads to ripple effects or empowerment. And that's the discussion I hope to have. So the first that we'll talk about is thinking about how the program promoted a sense of community. What was really key to our program or to this setting was having a membership from a very diverse and yet united Indigenous community. We have a conversation a lot about the degree to which diversity can also play a role in promoting community. And there's the paradox between the two, that the more diverse you get, the less that you can have community. But what we really found was that having diverse membership is what really supported people and brought people into the fold into this much broader Alaska Native Indigenous community. So one student shared, I'm going to get real personal. So I've always struggled with those feelings of not being Native enough, feeling that I don't belong to this community, but just coming here every week and being accepted, just being a part of conversations, and everybody treated me like I was one of them. So that really helped with those feelings of not being Native enough. Or another student shared, I used to feel like I was an outsider. that I wasn't really wanted or like it was cliquey or something. But when I was in this program and then I didn't feel that at all. And I felt like everybody was together. We actually found that having such diversity in the community is what promoted this broad sense of membership. We also found that students developed connections with each other and with elders in this space that really transcended time and space. One student would talk about we all shared the same experiences despite living in different parts of Alaska, which I related to a lot. Before, I felt like my experiences were my own and I felt like alone with them. And it was just nice to see that we all shared the same experiences. One of the facilitators also shared it's almost as if everyone there already had an understanding of you without explanation because we all come from different backgrounds and whatnot in different regions of Alaska, that we have a lot of similarities, that we didn't have to go and explain or re-educate people on where we come from, what our values are, and what our traditions are. It was just that sense of automatic connection between the students and with the elders. We also found that this space really sought to fulfill tangible and intangible needs. And that included things like being able to navigate the university, getting access to financial aid, finding help to find food or healthcare through the space. And it also included a lot of psychological needs and need for connection that students have. So one person shared a good example. The program helping me is just everyone I've met throughout this program too, and all those stories, both in helping to widen sense of perspectives and understanding what people go through and establishing the realization that if you reach out to these people, there's lots you can learn. Right? Another shared, you have this cohort of people that are all there to support you. And maybe you needed somebody to talk to about certain things back then that you never felt comfortable to talk about until this space. And finally, as we talk about sense of community, we found that there was this real bidirectional influence in the community where students felt like they were being influenced by the space, being influenced by the elders, being influenced by other students in the space and the way the setting was set up already. But then also that they had an opportunity to influence the space and to make it their own and to influence others in this space. I'm not going to read you all these quotes just for sake of time, but I love this one that a student said. When we lose an elder, it's like losing a library because they have so much knowledge. It's hard to connect with elders down here at, again, the university. And so it was amazing to be able to sit and listen to elders talk because we're learning those traditional values. We're learning our culture. It puts us in a gentle state of humility where we're sitting and we're listening and we don't think that we're the biggest, baddest individual. It's a gentle deflation of ego that helps us to be right sized and it helps us to almost revert back to that childlike state. That is essential for good mental health and good spiritual health and good social health. I'm a better community member when I have that right sized ego. And that's the beauty of having elders. We also found a lot of concepts that talked about how the setting served as this really empowering setting for students. And so I want to talk about some of those key ingredients as well. One was through shared leadership. We very purposely, like I said, had a very diverse group of elders who played a role in leading the space, and they rotated their leadership. What we also found, though, is because of the way that the setting was set up, that students took more leadership as they moved throughout the process and program, and especially as they moved even outside of the elders to their pure base time. So one elder shared, I enjoyed the student. I feel like I get more from them than they do me sometimes because they're sharing. It's a real nice reciprocity, a back and forth. And because of that, it really fostered a culture of growth and community building. And this is one of the richest themes that came out of this space. One facilitator said, the program just has really empowered me in more ways than I would think. And I'm still blown away by how much I have grown into my culture within this past year. Because it's crazy to me because like I said, I am around it. I was raised by UPIC elders. Keep in mind, this is someone who helped lead our program. But to do my own deep research has been life-changing. And I feel it in myself and my responsibility to put other people under my wing a little bit or get us together to start talking about these things. And we definitely to advocate on them. So by modeling that growth and knowing that identity development is this lifelong process, facilitators were able to make the space safe for students. The way in which uh, uh, the space was safe as well was through community agreements that we had that students all agreed to as they entered into the space and crafted together. And so one student talks about it as the safety net. They say, with the information about how we treated each other, it felt like I could be comfortable and actually talk about how I felt. I think I just felt safe. And it's not that I didn't feel safe in the other class, it's just that I couldn't see the safety net. And in this class, I could see it, I could hear it, I felt it if I tried to bounce on it. And because of that, this culture of growth and community building made its way outside of the counterspace as well. So another student said, you carry this program with you outside of the program. And you just think about it. I don't know exactly what we learned or what we discussed, but it influences my decisions and my daily thinking. And key to this as well, sorry, these quotes are small, but key to this as well was really this kind of idea of peer-based support. Very purposefully, we built into a space a time without elders that was really meant to be student-led. We had a facilitator in the room just to provide technical assistance, but really the intent of the space was to promote the students and sharing with one another and leading the space in the way they wanted it to be. And as people talked about this space, they talked about this peer-based support being critical to make that setting function as an empowering setting. So a facilitator shared, the students ended up sharing and talking and really getting to know one another in the second of the program. It ended up being a place where we could talk about things that were bothering us, things that we were excited for, and really reflecting together on what the elders talked about during the day. I think in that part of the class too, they really had a chance to share a little bit more. Right. Another student shared, but was empowering. It was just so different to have a space and time to not only be with elders, but also to be with a group of people who are walking through the same path at the same time. Another really poignant example I found of this was when a student shared a really difficult experience in this peer-led section. And one of the facilitators that was observing this said that the student asked a very simple question, which then led to a whole 50-minute conversation on that topic alone. The majority of the conversation was on how they could better advocate for themselves. They not only shared other experiences that they've had that are similar to the student's experience, but they all took it upon themselves to really wrap the student up with support and love and attention. You really saw this community from the beginning where they were just students, but all of a sudden, boom, as soon as something was wrong with one, they all came around to provide that student with so much support, and they all spoke up about it. So it was very student-led. And in this way, the space also offered opportunities to have multiple roles where students were and elders alike were both learners as well as teachers. And this again comes back to this kind of diverse membership. So a student talks about, so I come from a Yupik culture, and it was interesting to learn about the Tlingit and Yupik. And it was really nice to hear about not only listening to your own culture, but learning about what others are doing and how they do stuff and what their traditions are. I like learning about other people's cultures too and teaching what my traditions are. Elders noticed that students actually changed their roles in the space as they developed within the program, even in just these 8 weeks. So one facilitator said it took a little while for them to feel comfortable kind of owning up to the fact that they were learning about their cultures and starting to share more. But by sharing my experiences, it gave them permission to also share theirs. And students, again, then carried this out of the space. Lots of students, including the student quoted at the bottom, talked about how they were carrying on traditions now that they had delved into themselves more to be able to share with brothers, sisters, children, grandchildren, and using their e-portfolios in a place to be able to teach and share about culture over time. So this then brings us to the question of ripple effects. So can counterspaces, the cultural identity project, if we conceptualize it in that way, actually lead to change outside of the system? And I'm going to present a little bit of data to you and then tell you that I think that the jury's still out, and that's a conversation I'd like to have. One thing that we really found that within the content of the cultural identity project was that students felt like they had really developed critical consciousness from the program, understanding their rich history, as well as the forces of oppression that played a role in their experiences. So one student shared, I have so much rich history and so much reason to keep on resisting, finding ways to resist against the norm of what you should be. It's just empowering. There may be hard times. There may be times when you're like, why am I even going at this? Because I don't know where to turn to. Keep doing the history, keep doing your work, because somehow the universe and the creator just brings the right people and the right programs into your life at the right time. One day you're just going to be like, holy cow, I've really come a long way. And I might not have all the answers, and they still may not have the deep connections that I want, but this is good. I'm still on a journey, and there's still a lot more journey to be had. So keep at it. Don't ever give up, and don't ever feel like that you don't belong, because you'll find somewhere, some way that you do belong, even if it's your own way. You got to create your own belonging sometime. That critical consciousness was then also translated to systems around them. And students started to talk about changes that they wanted to see to the university system in particular. So one student shared, I would like to see this as a first step to decolonizing higher education. I feel like this would be a good way to decolonize that, and just to make education, one, culturally relevant, but two, just relevant in general to what is going on, to what it is that people are going to do with their lives. You know what I mean? And rethinking, what is it that I can do? This is innovative, what this program is doing. And so we started to also see this turn into some action. So students talked about wanting to extend the program or concepts that were in this space in their own ways outside of the work that had been done in the space. So students talked about forming Facebook groups or clubs in school. One student worked to put together a program where they engaged in storytelling and had people come in to tell stories, saying it's always been something that's been in the back of my head that we have to bring back. And now I'm getting that started. And students also brought it into spaces where they started to do land acknowledgements at the beginning of their presentations in class. Or one student who is also working at a school, a lower education school, brought that into the classroom and talked about land acknowledgements with students in this space as another example of kind of action or ripple effects out. So a couple closing thoughts, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions and your remarks. When we think about a space like the Cultural Identity Project, and we think about it as potentially the counter space, conceptualized in that way, oftentimes we found that the structure of the program was more important than the content itself. It was a very purposeful group of people with elders and really sought to promote a lot of the things that oftentimes we see embedded in counter spaces. But then it was the content that students were often referring to when they were talking about some of those ripple effects that might go beyond the space itself. They were talking about things they had learned about themselves or things that they were taking from that space and moving into the other. And so we think that it's both kind of the structure and the content that might be involved in a space like that makes a difference. I already spoke to you very briefly about this, but we also think a lot about kind of the community diversity dialectic. And I would argue that actually having diverse membership that centers around diversity is what allowed the space to really be able to blossom. And so we don't have to think about these spaces as particularly narrow, even when they are counter spaces. And we can have that diverse membership to support people in their growth. Counter spaces up until this point in time, the way that they're typically written about, or at least the ones that are talked about in this way, typically take place in person. And so we weren't quite sure how our program was going to translate into this virtual format. But the virtual space actually allowed for really diverse membership as well, and allowed students to show up as their full selves in a way that doesn't even always happen in person. So people came into the room with babies, with kids, with pets, with lots of things going on. And so the virtual space actually fostered some of that sense of community in a way that we hadn't anticipated. But what was critical about that was being able to provide resources for people to be able to join. So we were able to provide all the students who participated with a tablet, so they had technology to join. Also with the hotspots for Wi-Fi, because our connectivity throughout Alaska, particularly in rural Alaska, can be challenging. But the thing that I wonder about and next steps as we're going with this project is as we think about a counter space, ultimately the goal would be with these spaces to no longer need them as much, right? If we are uprooting the oppressive system that requires the use of counter spaces, um, then in theory, we wouldn't need them when we get rid of the oppression. And so oftentimes when I think about this work, I wonder about the degree to which counter spaces are transformative, right? And are able to really work towards empowerment beyond the system to facilitate structural change. That's something that's very difficult, of course, to research and take a look at, but it's something that I would love to have dialogue with you. So with that, I will close and open it up for questions. If you do want to contact me, my contact information is here. I'd welcome a phone call or an email, or we also have a website that talks about the project as well, where you can get in touch with them. So maybe I'll stop my share so I can see people better and see what questions people have or thoughts they want to offer out. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll maybe start us off with a question. Thank you for the great talk, Dr. Buckingham. That was, yeah, really cool. And as someone who feels like he's at the same point in his life as maybe a lot of the participants, university and kind of having your identity challenged, I wish I had something like that here at McMaster. I think in one of the quotes, um, the student used the wording gentle deflation of ego. I think when they were talking about being with elders, and I found that really cool. And I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on that, how the program helped the students put aside maybe their ego to help facilitate a change in identity, which is maybe really important for students who are coming into a new space, having their ideas challenged for the first time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of that came from modeling from our elders. One of the things that the elders did so beautifully in this space was model their own identity development over time. We had a number of elders who were in the program who had gone to boarding school and had really atrocious experiences at boarding school and a lot of trauma and pain. And they were willing to offer that up to students in a way that students could hear it because it's a lot, right? It's very heavy. It wasn't something that we could fully unpack in a space like that. But they were able to talk with students about not feeling sure of who they are and to model that journey is ongoing throughout life, that it's not that you have to arrive somewhere and that is your identity, that this can continue into your 70s and 80s and 90s. And I think that was really critical for students to be able to grasp and is something that we oftentimes don't think of. I know I don't think about a lot as, oh gosh, yes, I'm always learning and growing and having that permission. That's okay. That you can be an elder and still be growing in your identity was really powerful for students.
Totally. Yeah. I think one of the later quotes, one of the students said, I'm still figuring this out, or it's okay if I don't have all the answers. So, yeah, really cool to see how that translates.
Any other thoughts or questions from folks? They can also just be thoughts that you have. They don't have to be questions for me.
Yeah, maybe I'll ask Lori or Afroza if there are any questions, or if not, I also have a long list, but just give a chance for people to jump in.
Sigoli, I'm Lori. My question would be around the team analysis of your data and how did you have was that mostly composed of local people or how did you set that up?
Great question. So the team analysis of the data was largely myself and two PhD students who are both Alaska Native, one of whom was involved directly in helping to facilitate the project from the background. And so they actually attended all of the meetings with the elders and students in a way that I did not. And then another student who was not involved in that, and then myself. And the way that we approached the work was all really familiarizing ourselves with the data, first going through the kind of the data checking process. And then we all open coded the data separately, coming back together to talk through what we were seeing coming up. And that's what then led us to formulate a code book and come up with, eventually move towards the themes that we presented here to you today. But it didn't stop there. So we also shared, a big part of our work is sharing out our preliminary ideas with others. And so those ideas were shared in the form of kind of memos to our community advisory board for them to be able to hear what we were seeing coming up, for them to be able to take a look at it, see if it fit with what they were seeing and thinking about and what they knew, that then led to the paper that I was sharing from and the work here today. So a kind of a multi-stage process. I will say that the big thing that is a little challenging with any team-based data with that is, of course, thinking about kind of power differentials and how people show up in spaces. I'm really careful in my teams to talk about that quite openly, because I want to be able to have divergent perspectives and have those be raised and make sure that my ideas are not simply the ones that come to the fore, because I occupy this role as professor rather than student. And so by having everyone as much as possible be able to recognize what's going on, we were able to have really rich discussion in that way, all from our own standpoints and perspectives. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, yes, very well. Thank you.
In the same vein as Lori's question, I was wondering if I could ask about the advisory committee that was set up,
Mhm.
how it functioned in terms of structure, what input they had, because that seems rare for a research project that's funded and operating within those structures.
Yeah, it's how the funding cycle is always an interesting one. So our advisory board, we formulated before we did any research. And so and we had similar members over all stages of the project, although membership did shift a little bit as people's roles change. They informed everything from the focus groups and talking circles that we first did to inform the work, through the programming and how the research was set up when we pilot tested the program, and to where we shared our data back. People had varying capacities, of course, to be in a role like that. And so we certainly had some people who were perhaps more active than others, but everything had to be okayed by everybody in order for things to move forward. So usually it looked like the project team, which was me, some collaborators, and some collaborators around campus and students, bringing forth proposals and asking for input in that space, and then for folks to offer up what shift that they wanted to see, or what they thought would be a good way about doing so. So it was a pretty fluid space. We ranged from meeting once every month. Probably, I guess our most frequent meeting was once every 2 weeks when we were really in the thick of things. But there were other times when, and even at this point in time, where we might meet every 3 months or 4 months, depending on what's being done with the project. And now the advisory board actually, after the pilot, then brought on some students that participated in that space onto the advisory board to inform the next stages of the project. So there have been some kind of role transitions over time. I'm just seeing Lynn's comment that it's 6:30 in Alaska. It is. This was this is a nice way to start the day, though. It was great to get to know you all and to share this work with you.
Yeah, and I think on that note, we are close to time. So if maybe no one else has any questions, I will just say a big thank you to Dr. Buckingham for coming here this early, and for the great talk and for answering all the questions. Um, and we will let you go.
That sounds great. It was really nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I'll put my email in the chat in case you weren't able to grab it from the slide. I'm sure I'm Googleable as well. But if you do want to reach out, if you want to chat about the project at all, or be connected with anybody that's part of the team, again, I'm just one person of a much larger team. Please feel free to be in touch. And thanks for joining in.